The cities that were being developed from the 60s through to the 80s were about that, were about exclusion, the idea of the corporates building these icons to themselves, reflecting their own ideology. They weren't meant for the citizen. By the time this building was built, which was 1977, apartheid obviously had gathered momentum in the country and was now properly regulated. The university, unlike other institutions like at the time Nika Milan, which is now the Artscape Theatre, refused to adhere to the exclusive policies of making the audiences white only. From that perspective, this was a really important building in that it was designed to be an inclusive building. Even though where we're standing at the moment is actually privately owned, it's not actually a civic building, it's owned by the university, it has all the role of a public building. And the public building actually needs to, and for a public building to live into the future, needs to reflect the aspirations of the people. And I think this building, the Baxter Theatre, is certainly in that category. The architect was Jack Barnett, who has been dead for some years now, sadly. I think he had a very firm belief in that that people need to love the building they're in, and when they do, that love is reciprocated by the building. At the time it was built, I was a teenager, I was still in high school, and we had not seen anything like it. I remember that we looked at this building in awe, particularly with this big floating roof over the top of it, and this brickwork that nobody at the time was doing. If people were working with brickwork at all, it was in a much more regimented fashion. This idea of going with the rough-faced brickwork, which was not unpopular at the time, but that corbelled out, and people just weren't doing that. The brick actually is very rough. The face of the bricks were all taken off before they were put in the kiln to give this rough texture to the brick. So there was a huge amount of effort and work went into making each brick in this building. And so you don't want to brush up against the walls. But everything else, everywhere that you come into contact with in the building, particularly as you walk down the stairs, the balustrades and things, all this woodwork in the building, all the timber, is the thing that brings the softness of the building to you. So the things that you're going to touch are made in a way that invite you to touch them. The very idea of coming to put let's term it as a civic building on a slope is just anomalous. It's just a hard ask right from the beginning. And then to put two theatres into that space and manage to service them, all of that is a challenge. And the way that he brings you into the building through a sort of a winding street that takes you down to what I like to refer to as the town square, essentially. Town square on a hilltop town, maybe a sort of Italian type hilltop town. That route and the views out of the building, the views to the connections, the external connections of the building, I think are just really phenomenal. So all the entrances to the building, in fact, are downplayed. So when you arrive at the top, you come in through almost a slot actually between the roof and the floor. When you arrive at the bottom, you come into what it looks like it's going to be a grand entrance, but you're taken up on a side route. And the same as if you come around the right-hand side of the building, you come up through the landscape. Again, I think it speaks to me of this idea of the hilltop town square, where you always land up approaching it through almost obliquely, through little narrow streets, and then it opens up into this really generous internal space. Most big civic buildings will have a single entrance that has a street frontage, and there's some celebration of that frontage. This building is conceived differently in that it was conceived with a series of routes that run through the building. So staying with that analogy of the public square of a hilltop town, it really does do that. You can enter from the top, walk through the building, and emerge from the bottom. And nobody's going to stop you doing that. The acoustics of the public spaces are very bright. So there's a lot of echo, noise travels, which is absolutely the opposite to what is happening in the theatres in terms of from the audience perspective. Obviously from the stage, everything's designed to project sound off the stage. Here it's designed to echo around. You can have just a few people in here and the building feels alive. that there's a noise that travels through the building. That noise is not suppressed, but you don't feel isolated standing in the space. You feel like you're part of the bigger space of this building. But once you step into the two functional spaces, principal functional spaces, the two theatres, that just dissipates completely. I think for every architect, the challenge is when you're commissioned to design a building, and if you're fortunate enough to get a building of this scale, in order to resolve the design, you have to construct a narrative, and that narrative is what takes you through the process of designing the building. At the end of that process, the architect hands the building over, and in this case is handed over to, let's say, public life. At that point, the building assumes a life of its own. That life that a building has, I think, is incredibly important to its survival into the future, its sort of sustainability in a sense, in that if that building doesn't manage to carry that life, it's unloved and will become abandoned or altered irrevocably. This building, as being now 42 years old, has had virtually nothing done to it. There have been some minor internal modifications to the bar and the cafe, but otherwise virtually nothing, and is very clearly loved.